Hi everyone, so in this lecture we'll look at the roots of the ordinary world. This is actually the first part of two separate lectures where we look at the origins of our common beliefs, our common assumptions, our common approaches to solving problems, our common ways of writing a story or creating a piece of art, that ordinary world that defines usually how we're supposed to do it or what the good thing is supposed to look like. We looked at Truman Show the other day, or the past lecture, and noticed that it wasn't just Truman that was caught in an ordinary world, right? The most obvious thing to realize is that here's this person that's trapped on this literal island, right, in a fake city, so he has this ordinary world that he's engulfed in. But all of these people, all the actors within the town, the producers, all the people watching the show, they're all stuck in their ordinary worlds too. They're stuck with certain beliefs and assumptions about how to live their life, about the right way to find happiness is. For some, it's being an actor with no lines on a show that manipulates and enslaves a poor kid and watches him grow up. Right? For some, it's being the literal creator and dictator of such a show. For others, the ordinary world is saying to themselves, a good life is one where I continually watch this show. A good life is being entertained by the Truman Show. That's the utmost in life, as if there's nothing else in a good life, right? These are all aspects of an ordinary world. So the question is, how? How do we develop this ordinary world? How is it that we can become so stuck in it? How is it that it can have so much power over us that we don't ever question it? That we get so entranced by the shadows on our cave walls that we never decide to look behind us or to look outside. If you take a look at all those characters or all these people we just looked at from the show, why didn't anybody else question their beliefs, question their approach to living? Why didn't everybody else do that other than Truman? Right? So, what are the origins of this ordinary world? So we're going to split this up in two parts. I mentioned in the beginning, right? Psychologically speaking, there are types of behaviors referred to as covert behaviors. We'll talk about those next class. Covert behaviors are, how you think, how you perceive. They're the types of behaviors that are happening within your mind that other people can't see. So when you were doing the paper airplane exercise and you were thinking to yourself, what a paper airplane looked like, that belief, that thought, that's a covert behavior. The assumption you had in your head about what a glue stick was used for, right? That assumption, that belief is a covert behavior. There are things in your mind that we can't see from the outside. That is part of your ordinary world too, isn't it? Certain beliefs and perceptions and assumptions about how things are supposed to be. But there's also this more overt component, right? So psychologically, the technical term is overt behaviors. These are behaviors that we see you do. So when you are drawing, typically what's your approach to drawing? When you are dealing with group work, what is your typical approach to being parts of a group? So if you think back to your paper airplane exercise, do you recognize how your approach to working with your classmates was kind of like your typical approach? That it may be indicative of how you normally work with other people, right? And the role that you gave yourself within the group, well, maybe that's your ordinary role. That's the role you always take when you're doing group work, right? Or how did you physically start to approach the problem? What did you physically do, right? Those actions that we can see from you, right? Those behaviors are referred to as overt behaviors. So both covert and overt behaviors define our ordinary world. So we'll talk about overt behaviors first today. Why is it you do the things you do? Why is it you try to do some things over and over again and can't think of any other way of doing it? So to begin our discussion, I had you think about this question, right? If you were not worried about health and weight, what foods would you love to eat? And you gave me, as a class, a bunch of things, ranging from pizzas to hot dogs, potato chips to pretzels to, burgers and French fries and donuts and cupcakes and tacos. And so it was a good list, and I'll show you a list from previous class in a second. But the question I have for you right now is, do you know why you love them? Do you know why you like to eat pizza or French fries? You could say it tastes good, but do you know why it tastes good to you? Did you choose to like them? Did you choose to like a burger? Did you choose to like potato chips? Or do you just like them, right? For the most part, you just like them. You just like the taste. You didn't choose to like a burrito. Right? It just happened. You just like it. So what psychologists will tell us is the reason why we like these things really stems from unconscious forces. Now, to get a sense for what that means, what does it mean that it stems from an unconscious force? I asked you this question. Make a list of specific examples when you have done something by accident or have done something without thinking. And a lot of you gave me a bunch of really interesting examples, ranging from, calling your girlfriend another person's name, to accidentally slamming the door on somebody, to accidentally leaving your phone in the car, accidentally cussing, in front of a boss or a coworker, right? So to get a sense for the unconscious, we'll take a look at your list here of things that you had done accidentally or without thinking. And according to psychologist Sigmund Freud, all the things that you did by accident weren't really accidents. They were the result of unconscious processes. So Freud popularized the notion that our mind, our psyche, has both a conscious component and an unconscious component. Meaning, a lot of times we think we're behaving because we consciously are choosing to behave a certain way. I'm consciously choosing to raise my hand. I'm consciously choosing to say these words to you guys through this video. But Freud popularized the notion that the mind is actually primarily comprised of an unconscious or a subconscious, below conscious awareness component. And his famous analogy for the mind is an iceberg. Now, if you think about an iceberg, and this picture doesn't really do it any justice, if you ever go out on a boat towards an iceberg, what do you see? Well, you see a floating piece of ice above the water. But a majority of that iceberg is actually beneath the surface of the water, right? And what you literally see when you're on the boat is just the tip of the iceberg, when in fact a majority of it is below the surface of the water. Freud said the mind is the same way, that what we're conscious of right now, right, whatever that might be, well, that's the conscious part of the mind. So if I asked you to remember your name, right, so you bring it up to your awareness, my name is Jay, well, then now you're conscious of it, or Sally, or Ken, or Jason, but were you thinking about it before I asked you to? Or if I asked you, okay, I want you to think about your phone number, you can bring it up to your awareness, and you can now, or you can be conscious of your phone number. So it's in the conscious part of your mind, but were you thinking about it before I asked you to think about your phone number? So where did those come from? Where did your phone number, where did your name come from? Where did you get it to bring it into your conscious mind? Well, Freud says it was in your unconscious. It was in the subconscious part of your mind, part that's below conscious awareness. Think about what else might be there. What other things might be in your mind that if you tried hard enough, or if you wanted to, you could bring up to awareness. Your birth date, your friends' birth dates, your physical address, maybe what you ate this morning for breakfast, right? You can recall all those things, but you weren't aware of them a second ago, probably, unless you're starving right now. You probably weren't aware of them. They weren't in your conscious mind. They were, says Freud, in the unconscious part of your mind. Well, Freud's going to say there are some things that are harder to bring up than others. There are some things that are beneath, so closer towards the bottom of your unconscious, that it becomes really hard to bring up to your conscious mind. So things like maybe long ago memories of when you were a kid, maybe specific details that were unimportant to you. Like if I asked you, okay, uh, how many cars were there in the parking lot of your parking garage at work yesterday? I mean, you may had noticed, but it was such a detail that you didn't, a detail that was important to you that you didn't really store it in a way that was really accessible. Or, things that happened to you when you're 2 years old. I mean, you probably have that somewhere in your memory, says Freud, but it was so long ago that you don't remember it, or it's hard to bring up into your conscious awareness. But he also mentions things like traumas, things that you don't want to bring up, things that are painful to bring up. So past events in your life that were harmful, that caused you to suffer. Maybe it's hard to bring up into your awareness because your body, your mind doesn't really want to. Well, what else is in there? Not just your personal memories, but there could be what we call genetic memories, right? So as a species, we develop certain needs. And that's a memory. Our species has a need to hydrate and a need to feed itself and a need to be safe and a need to be loved. And maybe that's something that's developed in us as a species over time. That's part of our genetic memory. It's passed down to us. So that's in there because every once in a while you feel thirsty and you're aware of that. Every once in a while you feel hungry and you're aware of that. So there are unmet needs possibly in your unconscious. There are needs that you're not aware of, right? And when you go through certain experiences in your past, that may make you feel as if there are needs that were not fulfilled. So let's see how this works in terms of behavior. Freud says, well, we have needs that are in our unconscious. We don't really know the needs. All we really know is the feeling that it causes us to have. So as we mentioned, your body has developed, we as a species developed this feeling of thirst because our body needed to hydrate. So Freud would say, well, you don't really have direct conscious awareness of the need to drink water, but you have this feeling called thirstiness, right? And that's a signal to you that tells you, hey, you should do something for yourself because there's a need that's not being addressed. So it gives you a feeling of tension, says Freud. You have this feeling of tension that we label as thirst. Okay, well, what if your body needs nutrition? What if your body needs calories? Well, you're not consciously aware of that need per se, but you're aware of that feeling that we call hunger. And that's a feeling of tension, isn't it? Like it feels like something's off, that you have to do something about it. And then as a result of that feeling of thirst, of hunger, of any sort of discomfort, of any sort of tension, we then are compelled to act. We are then compelled to behave because we want to do something to alleviate that tension. Okay? Now remember, according to Freud, these needs are in our unconscious. We're not really aware of the needs. We're only aware of the feelings or drives. What's the big problem here? Well, if our tension, our feeling of tension is the only thing we're aware of, and we're not aware of the needs, there sometimes is the case where you actually don't do the right behavior to deal with the need, because you're not really aware of the need. All you know is you feel kind of off. So sometimes people will eat because there's this feeling that they're thinking represents hunger, but because in the brain, hunger and thirst come from a very similar area, it turns out we may not be hungry, but actually thirsty. Can you see how that could lead to some issues if we're eating when we're in fact thirsty? Or think about when you do get thirsty. What sorts of things do you drink? What types of behaviors do you do to get rid of that feeling of tension? Some people go towards alcohol when they're thirsty. Some people go towards iced tea when they're thirsty. Some people go towards iced coffee when they're thirsty. Well, think about those things. Are those actually addressing the need for hydration? Well, no. Some of those things make it worse. Some of the things actually make you even more dehydrated. So because the need is unconscious, and all we know is the feeling, the behaviors we use to get rid of that drive, that feeling of tension, don't necessarily always address the actual need. And if you don't address that need, what ends up happening? Well, the need grows, doesn't it? If you don't address the need, if you're hungry and you don't feed yourself, if you're thirsty and you don't hydrate, well, then the feeling of thirst gets worse, the feeling of hunger gets worse, right? Think about somebody who, as a child, let's say as an infant, were with their parents. Their parents took them to the grocery store, and then because their parents were stressed out and in a rush, they're loading all the groceries into the car. They drive away, but they forgot that they left you in the cart. Right? Pretty traumatic experience for a young baby. You grow up and you probably don't recall that at all, but you know that you have issues with partners who spend too much time away from you, or you have this fear of your partner leaving you, and you don't know where that comes from. All you know is you have that tension, that feeling there, right? Because you aren't aware of the need, that need to feel loved and to feel secure. And that feeling, right, that need that wasn't met all stems from a past experience that you don't recall. Can you see how that might lead to certain behaviors that may not be best for you because you're actually trying to fix something that you're actually doing something that doesn't really address what needs to be fixed? Or do you know anybody that has some sort of obsession, like they collect stamps all the time, or they're really into cleaning and they clean all the time, or they have to to work out as much as they can, right? Well, there's a feeling of tension that something's not right, and then their way of dealing with it is through some sort of behavior like collecting stamps or collecting coins or cleaning or working out. But the reason that they're so obsessed with it is possibly because it's not really addressing the need that's causing that feeling of tension. The feeling that there's something off, right, gets masked because maybe they get a little high when they collect a new coin for their set, or when they clean, it feels like they're doing something, and that masks the feeling of tension. Or they go work out, and after a good workout, you feel kind of good, and that masks the feeling of tension. But if they're not addressing why the tension's there in the first place, the real need, and they get continually caught up into doing more working out, right, to going to the gym more often, or they get caught up into collecting more stamps or doing more cleaning, because at least that relieves the tension for a little bit. So Freud says, we need to get in touch with our unconscious. We need to figure out what our real needs are and actually meet them. Think about addictions. Think about how people get caught up in alcohol addictions, or some other sort of substance abuse, or the reason, possibly according to this model, is that they have this feeling, this drive, this feeling of tension, and when they drink the alcohol or take in that other sort of drug, or when they participate in sexual activity, well, those things mask that feeling of tension. But if that feeling of tension stems from their childhood experience when they weren't loved by a parent, or the childhood experience when they weren't made to feel safe by their parent, well, then they're never going to get rid of that feeling of tension by just drinking the alcohol and taking certain drugs or participating in sexual activity. And as a result, that feeling of tension is going to grow and grow because that need continually is not being met. And so what do? Well, this amount of drugs doesn't work for me anymore, so I have to increase the amount to get rid of that feeling of tension. And then the spiraling happens where we have even more, or we desire even more of a certain substance, because that's what we need to get rid of that feeling of tension. Can you see how all these behaviors then are the result of these unconscious forces, according to Freud? Right? The result of these unconscious forces. So when we talk about difficulty leaving the ordinary world behind, if we are unaware of the reason why we behave, then for sure it'll be tough to leave behind, wouldn't it? Because we just keep doing the same pattern, the same behaviors, because it seems to work for the short term, and then we don't really realize why we're doing it in the first place. So Freud eventually, in his theories, started thinking about these needs, love, security, safety, thirst, these biological needs like thirst and, hydration. And, um, he looked and said, you know what, I think there's one need that's actually most pressing. There's actually one need that's so important that a majority of our behaviors are the result of that need. Any guesses on which need he thought a majority of our behaviors is the result of? Well, if you think about it, what is the most pressing need for our species to survive? Freud began to think that what drives most of your behaviors is the need to procreate. Right? Freud eventually thought that the majority of what you did was a result of unmet sexual desires. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of or a list of things that people have done by accident, all right, without thinking. According to Freud's theory, a majority of these are the result of unmet sexual desires. Can you imagine why you might call your girlfriend by a different name as a result of unmet sexual desires? Think about the physical action of checking your phone. How might that be related to an unmet sexual desire? Leaving a drink on top of your car, so imagine somebody accidentally left their drink on top of their car. Freud would say, well, think about that very carefully. You didn't accidentally leave that drink on top of your car. What happens when drinks are on top of cars that move? They spill. Can you relate spilling at all to unmet sexual desires? How about actually putting the wrong food in the fridge? Maybe there's some food that you wanted to eat or whatever, and you put it in the fridge by accident. Freud would say, well, think about that. Is there anything in your possession that you'd like to put someplace that might be related to unmet sexual desires? So he had this belief that everything, if not at least majority of things, are the result of us having sexual needs that aren't being met. What do you think about that? What do you think about the accident you listed or the thing you did without thinking? Can you relate that to Freud's theory of unmet sexual desires? In fact, even today, if you take a look at basic psychology books, you might have seen Freud's personality typology. Typology is just a map, and Freud had various ways of labeling personalities, different people's personality types. So you create this map of personalities where a lot of these personalities are related to sexual organs within the body, right? So if you've ever heard of the term anal retentive, if somebody's uptight as a personality, well, that comes from Freud's theories on how unmet sexual desires play such a huge role in our behaviors. Okay, so modern psychology. When we take a look at modern psychology, people don't nowadays, because if you look at the time of Freud, this is about turn of the century, modern psychology doesn't really think that what you do is the result of unmet sexual desires, at least not a majority of your behaviors, right? When you forgot to do your homework, that may not have been because of an unmet sexual desire. When you accidentally overpaid for a textbook, when a cheaper one could have been found, that may not have been the result of an unmet sexual desire. When you called your dog by your mom's name, that may not really have been the result of an unmet sexual desire. But what psychologists do tell us is that a lot of our behaviors actually are the result of unconscious forces, right? Even though they may not be the result of unmet sexual needs, a lot of what we do is the result of forces beneath conscious awareness. So let's take a look at our list of foods that you had written down or entered for our discussion. Here's a typical list of past classes. Do you see any things that are in common with these foods? Again, you could say they taste good, but the question is, why do they taste good to you? What you may notice is that a lot of these foods are salty. A lot of these foods have fat. And a lot of these foods have some sort of sugar or carbohydrate, right? All three of those things are needed and necessary for your body to function. And not only that, but our ancestors needed to create or develop a desire for these things in order to survive in harsh realities, in the natural world. Salt helps retain water. It helps with cellular functions. Sugar, right, helps give us quick sources of energy. Fats help us with, again, having access to energy. So all of these things were things that our ancestors needed to develop a desire for in order to propel the species forward. Now, if you think about it, that means that your desire for these things weren't the result of your conscious choice, but were already programmed into you. The desire for salty foods, the desire for fatty foods, the desire for carby, sugary foods, all there because you or your ancestors needed those things in order to make it through surviving in the jungle or the desert. Behaviors now being the result of unconscious forces. But the next real question to ask is why those particular foods? Okay, so maybe you can accept that a lot of your behaviors are the result of unconscious forces, right? But why the pizza for the fat and the salt? Why the French fries for the carbs and the salt, right? Why the donut for the sugar? Why those particular foods? I mean, why not go for a fruit or some other food that maybe somebody else mentioned that you don't really care for? Why the particular foods you listed? Well, let's think about this. One question that's related to this: why any particular thing at all in life? Why do you want the car, the house, the shoes? Why do you want a particular hairstyle? Why do you want anything particular in your life? Right? I mean, it might be conditioned into us to want shelter. It may be conditioned into us, right, to want to survive harsh weather. But why the 3.5 bedroom house? Or the 3 bedroom, 2.5 bath house, right? Why the big house? Why this fancy car, right? Why the fancy shoes? Why those particular things? Well, one possible answer is that even though we have a genetic need or a genetically programmed desire to have certain, or to want certain things like the fats and the sugars and the salts, it could be that through experience, right, through living our lives, we become programmed to think that the best way to pursue those are these specific things, right? So as a result of past experience, these are the behaviors that we have been conditioned to have when certain feelings arise. So why the purse? Why the certain pair of shoes, or the certain type of haircut, or the car or the house? Well, why want those things? Right? If we're not genetically programmed to want a house or a purse, maybe that as we grow up, we become conditioned to want those things. We can become conditioned to want the hamburger, the French fries, because in our culture, that's what we were exposed to. McDonald's commercials, right? Pizza Hut around the corner. Your friends going to the pizza parlor after the Sunday soccer game, right? The culture is telling us that's where to go to fulfill those needs. That when you have this drive that comes up for hunger, right? Or for salty foods or for carby, sugary foods. This is what we go towards. That's what the culture maybe is programming into you, right? And not just programming that, but programming the desire for the shoes and the car and the house and etc. So how does that work? How does culture, how do your friends, how does media program us to desire those particular things? By the way, if you take a look back to the food analogy, right? If you belong to a particular culture and you're not exposed to another culture, there might be foods there that are sugary and salty and fatty that you'll never have a desire for, right? If you grew up in a culture where there was no burgers and french fries, you probably don't have a desire for burgers and french fries until you taste them, right? But because you weren't exposed to a culture that had certain food items, you don't have a desire for it. Okay, so let's see how this works. I gave you a video to watch from the TV show The Office, where we saw how one of the characters, Dwight, kept putting his hand out to get some mints. And notice that he became trained to do that. His behavior, putting out his hand out, became trained over a period of time. This is what is referred to as classical conditioning. Okay, so briefly, how classical conditioning works. We have certain responses, right? Natural, instinctual responses to certain stimuli. So if you smell good food, your body's going to instinctually start to get ready to eat it. And one of the first things it does to get ready to eat it is to salivate. Okay? If I blew into your eye, I don't need to train you to respond to it. Your eye will naturally blink, right? That's an instinctual response to a stimulus that you have a inherent response to. If I were to pinch you, or if you were to pinch yourself, right, you may say ouch, or you may wince. Well, that response of saying ouch or wincing, I mean, that's something that's already there. It's an inherent, unconditioned stimulus. So we have all of these types of unconditioned responses to unconditioned stimuli. Right? We have all of these natural responses to things. Classical conditioning shows us that those natural responses can start to be paired with more neutral stimuli, where that neutral stimuli starts to cause us to have certain responses. So within the clip for the show, we saw Dwight start to be conditioned to put his hand out, right, to get the mint. And eventually he became so trained, so conditioned that he put his hand out just because of that little computer sound, because that computer sound was paired with him getting the mints. So now the computer sound becomes so associated with him getting the mints that it causes a reaction, a physical reaction in him. The famous example from science, right, is Pavlov's dog, where dogs naturally salivate like we do to the smell of good food. And over time, whenever a researcher would come in to give some dogs food, right, a bell would ring first because the researcher would walk into a room. So a bell would ring indicating that the door would open and the researcher would come in. And then he'd give the dog the food, and they noticed that the dog would salivate, which is expected, right, because dogs salivate when they smell food. But what they eventually noticed is that every time the bell would ring, eventually the dog would naturally start to salivate, even though there's no reason for them to salivate just because of a bell. What happened was that the ringing of the bell became so closely tied to, it became paired with the meat in the dog's biology that itself, the bell ringing, would cause the dog to salivate. I'll give you a personal example, or at least one you can think about for yourself. Let's imagine I were to blow into your eye, right? If I blew into your eye, you would naturally blink. But what if I were to say your name first before I would blow into your eye? So I said John, and then I blow into your eye, and then John, I blow into your eye. What eventually might happen? Well, eventually your name being said might become paired with the sensation of the blowing of your eye, that you might start to blink whenever somebody said your name, right? So then you have these weird behaviors, these weird responses and you don't really know where they come from. right? Or if I was a mean teacher and I would put shock devices on your chair, and every day, beginning of class, I'd say hi, and then I would press a button that would shock everybody, right? So I'd say hello, and then I press a button, and everybody would wince and jump in pain. What would eventually happen? Well, eventually it might get to the point where whenever somebody says hello to you, you start to wince in pain. So this overt behavior, this response, right? That's the result of an unconscious force. It's the result of this conditioning, this training that's been happening in you. And can you see how this might be something that's in your life right now? Can you see how your behaviors sometimes may not be very rational, and you wonder where they come from, and they could have been the result of a past experience? I mean, can you relate this to products and how you might have a natural feeling of excitement, right? Our equivalent of drooling whenever you think about certain types of products, like a laptop or a new iPhone or a new pair of shoes or a new purse or a new car. How does that work? How do we become conditioned to have that sort of excitement response to those items? Well, think about any commercial that features those things. Let's use one of my favorite examples is to use the Axe body spray commercials. If you're not familiar with those, Axe body spray, it's a deodorant, right? You're spraying yourself, and it's targeted towards males. Males are the target audience for these body sprays. And in the commercials, what you'll see usually is lots of scantily clad women flocking to any guy that's using the body spray. Right? So there's a guy, he's spraying himself, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of scantily clad women flocking towards him. Okay. If you think about it, what in that commercial do men have a natural feeling of excitement about? Well, I mean, if you're a heterosexual male and you see a attractive, scantily clad woman, your biology is going to get excited, right? It's just something that's part of you. It's inherent within you to have this feeling of excitement. Well, notice that the commercial, they're causing you to naturally have that feeling of excitement, but they're pairing it with their product. And just like the bell with the meat, right, or your name with me blowing into your eye, that product will soon be so paired with, the scantily clad attractive female, that the product alone may start to cause you to have that sort of feeling of excitement. Wow. Can you start to see how our shadows start to develop, right? How we start to have behaviors that don't really come from us, but are programmed by other people. Think about any past experience that maybe didn't go your way, and how now you have weird feelings about certain things. Like maybe you get extremely nervous when you go into a job interview, or you walk into a room and certain types of people cause you to feel anxiety, right? That could have been the result of a past experience where this feeling of fear, right, may have come from a legitimate source, but it was paired with a certain type of person, or it was paired with a certain type of environment, like a job interview, where now you have these very neutral stimuli that are causing you to have that fear and anxiety. Yeah. I mean, think about some poor kid who, as they're growing up, their father would not know how to deal with their own stress. And so the father would find any sort of excuse to blow up at the kid, right? So the father comes home, kid's toys are on the floor as a mess, and the father overreacts and grabs his belt to punish his kid for the toys being out. The kid grows up, becomes an adult, and, he has this weird feeling every once in a while, this weird feeling of fear that overcomes him, or anxiety that overcomes him. And if you look closely, a feeling comes whenever there is some male that puts their hand close to their belt. So this feeling, right, this response slowly became conditioned into them, and they don't really know why. They don't know where it comes from, right? This overt behavior is part now of their ordinary world. Okay, I also showed you a clip where I had you watch a clip from The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon would give chocolates to Penny whenever Penny did something Sheldon liked, right? And eventually the idea is that Penny becomes conditioned to do certain behaviors. This is a form of conditioning referred to as operant conditioning. So the idea is if there's a behavior that somebody wants, the person that wants it would follow it with some sort of positive reinforcer. That means you give that person who did the behavior something they desire, something they want. In the example with the film clip or the TV clip, right, Sheldon gave the chocolates. That's a positive reinforcer. Think about parents and how they use this for their kids, right? You say to your kid, okay, you do your homework for today and I'll let you eat some candy, or I'll let you watch TV. So the parent is trying to condition the behavior of studying, of doing the homework, and they're trying to condition it by providing a positive reinforcer, something that the parent or the kid would want. In this famous example, right, here's a pigeon, and the pigeon is in this room or this box, and there's certain buttons in this box, and a button, when pressed, would spit out some food for the pigeon. Another button, when pressed, would give the pigeon something it did not desire, maybe shock, right? Eventually, the pigeon would become conditioned to press the button that delivered the food. And in fact, when they pressed a certain button that delivered the food, they would do that so often, right, where the food was the positive reinforcer, that eventually the pigeon would continually press that button even though it wouldn't give them the food anymore. Right? So can you see how a lot of our behaviors are kind of conditioned in this fashion, where because somebody provides us with a positive reinforcer, or somebody could provide us with some sort of punishment to change our behavior, right? So our parent might say, yeah, if you don't finish your homework, you're going to have to mow the lawn, right? If you don't finish your homework, you're going to have to finish all your vegetables. Right? You give the child something they don't want in order to change their behavior. Right? That's punishment. You can do that to alter somebody's behavior. Right? That's still a form of operant conditioning. Behavior followed by some sort of reinforcer. Can you see how your behaviors may be the result of this sort of conditioning? Right? We talked about children, but think about how the law works. If you run through a stop sign, the police catch you, how does the government try to condition you to have a certain behavior? Well, you get a fine, right? Or if you break some other sort of law, you get put in jail. All of those are forms of punishment in order to condition a certain type of behavior. But it turns out there might be more to our behaviors than just laws, and more than just how our parents conditioned us to behave. But just think about your interactions with people on a daily basis. What you wear, how you talk. Can you see how a lot of those may be the result of operant conditioning? Where when you wear a certain attire and somebody gives you a compliment, then you have this positive reinforcer that reinforces you wearing that same sort of thing. Or when you act a certain way in front of certain social circles and they give you compliments, or they laugh at your jokes, or they do something you like, that acts as a positive reinforcer for you to continually act in that sort of way. And think about how this then starts to formulate your ordinary world too. And think about Truman and how, if he went out with the right person, if he went to the right job, if he bought the right house, he was probably, given some sort of reinforcer in order to maintain that behavior in the movie or in that TV show, right? Think about anything that you do, or that you desire, or that you think you want out of life. Can you see how that might have been the result of some sort of operant conditioning, right? In fact, as you go about your daily life, when people give you compliments, or they give you insults, or you get somebody giving you a pat in the back, or they give you a weird look that you don't really like, how all of that influences your behavior to some extent. It's all some form of operant conditioning. Well, besides those two clips that I had you watch for before coming to this lecture, two other forms of conditioning I'd like to walk through with you. One has to do with familiarity, and it turns out the more often we see something, the more likely it becomes a preferred stimulus, meaning that you tend to like things that you see more often. So a couple of studies with regards to this. One study had a bunch of volunteers in front of a computer screen, and they'd be flashed random non-ordinary symbols. So not symbols like these that I have here, but symbols that you would not recognize. And they'd be flashed, not symbol, shapes, sorry. They'd be flashed these shapes over and over and over again. And then at the end of this session, they'd be given an image, or they'd be shown all of the shapes that were presented to them and asked, point to the one that you like the best. That's kind of a weird question, right? Which shapes do you like the best, especially when they're shapes you're not familiar with? And it turns out more often than not, people would point to the shape that they saw most frequently within the study, right? The same thing was done with faces. So volunteers would sit in front of a computer screen and they'd be shown various faces, flash faces. And in fact, the faces, just like with the shapes, would go so fast that you can't really, it's hard to remember what you saw, right? So a bunch of faces flashed really quickly. And then again, they were shown after the session, all the faces, and asked, okay, which face do you like best? Now, it went so fast that they couldn't remember which ones, they saw, but still, they often pointed to the ones they saw most frequently. Think about how that conditioning works in our ordinary world, that if we're exposed to certain things more often, we tend to like it more. Think about how that might relate to what you like in life, what you want in life. Think about why certain companies spend so much money on commercials, even though people say they hate them. Right? Think about what it means for parents who limit exposing their kid to other cultures or other types of people. Can you see how that might influence what they're going to grow up feeling about certain types of people? Fourth is that we're often conditioned just through repetition and habit. So I am going to assume that many of you brushed your teeth this morning. If you didn't, that's okay. I'm not going to judge you for it. But when you brushed your teeth this morning, how many of you consciously chose which tooth to brush first? $10 says you just brush your teeth like normal. You didn't even think about it, you just did it. You didn't really consciously choose which tooth to brush first. All right. Think about taking a shower this morning. Again, I'm not going to judge you if you did not take a shower before watching this video. But when you do take a shower, how many of you consciously choose which body part to wash first? Or do you just go in there and just take a shower, right? For most of us, we don't consciously debate, I'm going to wash my left pinky first, or I'm going to wash my left foot first. We just do it. We just go through and take our shower like we normally do, right? Like we're in the habit of doing. One more example. So I have no idea what you're wearing while you're watching this video, but let's assume you have some pants on. How many of you consciously chose which leg to put into your pants first? Did you actually sit there and wonder, I think I'll do left leg first today, or just put on your pants like you usually do? Well, you probably, if you're like most of us, you probably just put them on like you usually do. In fact, like most of us, you probably did all of these things without really thinking about them. In fact, you probably did most of these things while thinking about something else. You're probably thinking about something else rather than your teeth while you're brushing your teeth. You're probably thinking about something else rather than the water washing over you while you were taking your shower. You're probably thinking about what you had to do today and all the problems that you're dealing with, or how much homework you have, or how you're late for work, or your mind is probably someplace else. And these behaviors were really the result of habit. They're the result of you having done them over and over again, that you no longer place any thought onto them, which means those behaviors were conditioned. And if you really think about the things you do in your day, Like literally all the things you do in your day, from getting up, getting out of bed, to whatever it is you do next, making breakfast, brushing your teeth, combing your hair, washing your face, whatever it is. I bet you a lot of those things you did without really consciously choosing to do them. You just did them because you always do them, right? Conditioning through habit. Well, take a look at the picture we have of how we come up with all of these behaviors in our ordinary world. It seems as if we are literally programmed, either by genetics for us to have certain desires, or through experience, right? Manifest those desires in certain ways, to have certain behaviors that address those needs and desires in certain ways. Can you see now how or why it might be hard to escape our ordinary world, when a lot of what we do is really influenced by things that we don't necessarily think we have control over? Genetics and experience. The culture you grew up in, the parents you grew up with, right? The friends you grew up around, right? The movies you watched, the TV shows you watched, the commercials that fill up the TV screen. All of that stuff seems to influence us and to dictate those shadows that we see on the walls, which then dictates to us what we maybe should want and value out of life, rather than us thinking about it for ourselves, which then influences what we think a good painting looks like, right? Or how to make a good painting, or how to write a good song, because maybe somebody reinforced the correct way when we were younger, right? Maybe you had a teacher that taught you the right way of writing music, or the right way of playing a sport, and now that is conditioned into you, and it's kind of hard to break free from it, because you don't even think about trying to break free from it, because you accept it as your reality. Okay? So when we come back in our next video, we'll talk about the behaviors that we can't see, right? How is it that we have certain perceptions in our heads, and certain beliefs in our heads, and certain assumptions about, what something's supposed to look like in our head? Where did those come from? We'll talk about that in our next video.